Hi there! Today I want to share a delightfully difficult poem with you, one which defies easy interpretation, and that is Wulf and Eadwacer from the Old English Exeter book. Welcome aboard the International Express to Book Central. Grab a seat, settle in, and let's get medieval. I'm your host Jules, and for this Let's Get Medieval episode, I wanted to dive back into Old English poetry. I already shared The Dream of the Rood with you a while back, but while The Dream of the Rood, in a sense, is more straightforward, because we know it is a narrative about Christ and about his death and resurrection, some of Old English poetry, or, well, perhaps most of it actually, is quite difficult to get close to. It's not always clear what is happening, who is speaking, and kind of what themes are being addressed. And that's something I want to give you a taste of today. So get ready to join me in interpretative confusion, but hopefully it'll also be a fun ride. First, I'll read the poem to you, which is very short, and then we'll dive into what genre it might be, what it might be trying to tell us, what some of the difficulties are when it comes to interpreting or even translating the poem. And hopefully by the end, well, you might not have clear answers, but you'll have more information. So, here comes the translation. I'm going to be using Elaine Trehairne's translation, which you can find on Wikipedia, but also in her anthology of Old and Middle English. I would highly recommend it. I do really like her translation, hence why it's the one I'm sharing with you. Here we go. It is to my people as if someone would give him a gift. They will consume him if he comes into their troop. It is different with us. Wulf is on an island, I on another. That island is secure, surrounded by fen. There are bloodthirsty men on the island. They will consume him if he comes into their troop. It is different with us. I pursued in my hopes the far journeys of Wulf, when it was rainy weather and I sat sorrowful. Then the battle-bold one laid his arms around me. To me was joy in that, yet it was also hateful to me. Wulf, my hopes of you have made me sick, your rare visits, a mourning mind, and this is not at all from a lack of food. Do you hear me, Eadwacter? A wolf bears our wretched whelp to the woods. That may be easily separated, which was never bound, the riddle of us two together. So there you have it. That is the poem in all of its short but delightful complexity. As you can already tell, there is a narrator, an I speaker, who tells us of their trials and tribulations, of the sorrow that they're facing, but they never name themselves. There are two named characters, though, and, well, I'm going to go into them first. So first there seems to be a man named Wulf, who is beloved by our narrator. Our narrator followed them, or wanted to follow them at the very least, on their far journeys through rainy weather, and yet now they are separated. Physically, geographically, Wulf is on one island, our narrator on another. On top of that, there are other complications, though. It seems to be that our narrator is surrounded by their people who would want to consume or kill or harm Wulf. So they have to stay separated. However, this separation makes our narrator sorrowful. They say that they have a mourning mind, so mourning with OU. They are lamenting something, and it is most likely their separation, and it has made them sick. So that is the first character that we kind of get really introduced to. But then there is another one who gets directly addressed by our narrator, which is Eadwacter. The narrator says, "Do you hear me, Eadwacter?" seemingly addressing him directly. Now, we're not entirely sure when I say we, I mean myself and other Old English scholars, were not necessarily entirely sure who Eadwacter is, to what extent he is, for example, the narrator's partner. If he is the same as the battle-bold one who laid his arms around the narrator earlier in the poem, a few lines above. Perhaps what we seem to be conjecturing is that our narrator was initially with Wulf, that they loved him, but that because of his absence, they have now found a new partner, someone who gave them comfort, which is how they found joy in his embrace, and yet who is not their real love. This Eadwacter is not Wulf, and therefore his embrace is also hateful to our narrator. Now, this is also then again complicated by the last few lines, where a narrator speaks of a wolf who bears our wretched whelp to the woods. This comes directly after the narrator has addressed Eadwacter. So it seems to be that the narrator talks about their child with Eadwacter, and that child seems to be doomed or is being dragged off into the woods towards potential death by a wolf. Now, this is where our first language complication comes in, because as I'm sure you can imagine from the sounds themselves, the name wolf, W-U-L-F, is the same as the Old English word for wolf, the animal. Now, what do we do in this situation? What do we consider the second instance of wolf to be? Is this the animal, an animal who might be taking this child away, or is it the man wolf who our narrator previously loved? Has he taken the child that they had with Eadwacter away? Is he the one who is dragging that child off into the woods? We don't know. And now you might be wondering, why are you giving me all of these questions? Are you at any point going to give me answers? And this is one of the difficult things to understand and then eventually appreciate about the study of literature, but also especially the study of medieval literature. We do not always have enough information to give decisive answers. And when I say we usually don't, that's really the case. So in a lot of cases, we will just have a text. There will be no title. There will be no capitals. When it's a poem, it is usually not written in verses, which means the lines are just written one after another, and then editors and translators kind of need to figure out from rhyme and meter where the end of a line may have been, where a stanza might have ended. And then on top of that, well, we don't know who wrote it. We don't know who might have first composed a poem like this. And we don't know why it would have been put in a specific manuscript. So we are dealing with loads of questions and very limited information. If, like me, you enjoy a good detective game, then this is actually a lot of fun. But when you then need to write an essay or a paper or anything like that, it can be a little bit difficult to realize, oh, so there are no set answers. Everyone is just conjecturing. Yeah, to a certain extent we are. What makes the kind of academic discourse around poems like this slightly different from conjecture, however, is that we do dive into the poem. We use whatever evidence we have to come to certain conclusions. We might all come to different conclusions. But if we're using the same source material, well, how wrong can you be then? It might be an interpretative difference, but that can only enrich our understanding. Because literature and poetry are different from hard facts, data. They are subjective. They speak to the human experience. So while every reader, every listener is going to have a slightly different connection to a text, they're going to be drawing slightly different aspects from it. And none of those are wrong. It's worth saying you can't be wrong in your response to a piece of art. People might say, well, what you're seeing there might actually be this and that behind it. Fair, but if your gut instinct says, this piece of poetry is beautiful, or this piece of poetry makes me sad, that is important information and that is a valid response. So that is how we get to so many different questions with a poem like this. And because there are so many different interpretations possible, I'm just going to share my own one with you. And I'm going to build that on some of the evidence from the poem and on some of the scholarship that has been done. And of course, you're welcome to have your own interpretation. If it does drastically differ, please do tell me. I would love to know what you think. So let's dive into kind of what we think is going on. So far, I've spoken of the narrator, our narrator, they, etc. But actually, we do, to a certain extent, have an indication of who our narrator is. Some of that we can draw from the plot. So we're talking about a person who has a male partner, who has a child. That seems to speak towards a female narrator. On top of that, which you would have to get from the Old English, there are grammatical indications that we're talking about a female narrator here. So for example, when the narrator says, I sat sorrowful, the Old English adjective for sorrowful, reotugu, is in the feminine case ending. Now, modern English doesn't really have case endings in adjectives anymore, but a lot of Germanic languages do, for example, like German, and Old English did as well. So by the fact that that adjective that describes the narrator's state of mind has a feminine case ending, that kind of adds evidence to our hypothesis that the narrator is female. So then what we have here is a female narrator, a female character who is on an island, separated from Wulf, who we kind of take from the text is her lover, someone she cares for deeply, because she wanted to pursue him on his journeys. She is sorrowful about the fact that he is away, and she is concerned about her family's maybe ill intents towards him. Then this female narrator, seemingly in her sorrow and in her exile, because she seems to be so separated from society, she finds another man, or she is found perhaps, who might be Eadwacter. And she has a child with him, and yet in the back of her mind are still these memories of her first lover, whose absence makes her sick. And she speaks of the riddle of us two together, which might be referring to her and Wulf. The fact that that may easily be separated, which was never bound, could be referring to them. Perhaps they were never properly united in marriage, or perhaps there were other things going on, but clearly there was a connection there which was not solid enough to withstand social pressure from her family, from her peoples who are willing to kill him. So we have a female narrator, and it is worth spending some time on that, because not a whole lot of medieval poetry or prose is necessarily written from the female perspective. And this brings us also to a question of genre. What is this text? So I've been calling it a poem. That we can go with. The poem seems to follow kind of the Old English Germanic rules of poetry. There is alliteration, etc. So it definitely is a poem. It's not a prose text. But what is its genre? Because perhaps if we can figure out what the genre is, we can make a little bit more sense of the story that is going on. Now, this is where it's worthwhile coming back to the manuscript that this poem exists in. There is only one copy of this poem, which makes it a little bit more difficult, because maybe if there were different versions of the poem, then together they would reveal more about the themes and about the meaning. But no, we only have one. This is what we have. That is what we need to get on with. So this poem is found in the Exeter book, as I mentioned before. The Exeter book is one of the few remaining Old English codices. So a codex, as I spoke about in our episode on manuscripts, is just a big manuscript collection almost bound into one book. The Exeter book is a very big codex, and we believe that it was produced, well, in the late 10th century, so towards the end of the 900s. It is one of 4, as I think I've already mentioned before, and what the Exeter book is really well known for are its riddles. Now, the riddles don't make up the entire manuscript, but because the riddles are so interesting, they get a lot of attention. On top of the riddles, we also have a number of poems. We also have the maxims, which are kind of these gnomic statements about how the world works. We also have texts about Jesus, we have saints' lives, and we have other poems which seem a little heroic yet mystical, etc. These poems, all of them are hard to interpret and translate. So it's not only Wulf and Eadwacer which does not have a title in the manuscript, none of the poems have a title, and they just come one after the other, and we've kind of had to figure out, okay, where does one poem end and where does another start? Now, what is interesting is that Wulf and Eadwacer has a lot of interesting similarities with some of the other poems in the text. So just before Wulf and Eadwacer, we get a poem called Deor, which is, well, you could almost call it a begging poem in which a poet talks about how he's been sent away from the hall, from the king for whom he used to work, and he kind of is without land and without help, and he lists these historical or heroic, legendary bad things which have happened, and each time he talks about one of those, he ends it with, "That has passed, this shall pass too." So we kind of get some of the similar elements there in the sense that we have a tragic tone, we have a refrain that repeats itself. In the case of Deor, it's "that passed, this shall too." In the case of Wulf and Eadwacer, we twice have that repetition of "they will consume him if he comes into their troop, it is different with us." And that is important because we don't see a lot of refrains in most of the other poems. So we have a shared sense of tragedy in those two poems. After Wulf and Eadwacer and the manuscript, we get quite a lot of riddles, and then we get The Wife's Lament, which is a poem in which a female narrator, which again we know because of the adjective endings and the fact that what she seems to describe fits more traditionally into maybe a female perspective. She is lamenting the fact that her husband has betrayed her, that he has left, and that now she's all alone, that she has been rejected by society, and that all she can really do is speak of her sorrow and hope that he will be as miserable as she is. So that fits very interestingly with Wulf and Eadwacer. So we get two poems from a female perspective which seem to mourn the limits on the female experience, the limits on their agency, and on the cruelties potentially committed against them by their societies and by men. There's also a ways back in the manuscript, so quite a few folios further, The Husband's Message, which is a poem that describes a message a husband sends to his wife saying, "I've been away all this time, but now finally we can be together. Please come join me." Now, it is again worth remembering that none of these titles are in the manuscript. These are titles that scholarship initially gave to these poems, and now those titles are kind of stuck and you can't really change them, because if you're like, no, this is, instead of Wulf and Eadwacer, this is just poem 5, no one will know what you're talking about. So we all have to stick with these titles. However, hopefully from that quick overview of some of the other poems surrounding Wulf and Eadwacer, you can see that, well, wherever this poem first came from, it got put into a collection of poetry that seems to engage with, well, the hardships of a heroic culture, a certain interest perhaps in the suffering that that kind of culture can cause, and also an interest perhaps in the female perspective of things. Now, I've kind of glossed over the riddles so far, and that is because I wanted to give it separate attention. So the riddles in this collection are delightful. Most of them are written in such a way that you can come up with an absolutely filthy answer, and then you have to kind of dial it back from there and find an object which they are about. So most of these riddles, they speak from the perspective of the object that they describe. So for example, I am long and I wind and I can drag you away, or I can give you sustenance, like these kind of statements, which then bring you closer and closer to a hopeful answer. Now, none of these come with an answer in the Exeter book, so scholarship has been trying to figure them out, and for most of them, for example, there are Latin analogies which do come with answers, so we can be like, okay, this is probably a poem about an onion. Great. Some of them we do not know what the answer is. We have conjectures. We have kind of hypotheses based on evidence from the poems, but none of it is conclusive enough that we can definitively say this is a riddle about that. Now, the reason that the riddles as context are also interesting and important is because for a while, Wulf and Eadwacer was seen as a riddle by scholarship, because it is hard to figure out what is going on. And the fact that it's also difficult to figure out what is going on is because the poem is polysemous. Now, what does that mean? Polysemous basically means that a word can have different meanings, or that its meaning is obscure because there are different options for how you could translate it. That is also something the riddles enjoy doing. They like playing with our ideas of like, maybe we should translate it this way. Well, maybe if you translate it that way, maybe that makes more sense. And then it really becomes like a puzzle game. With Wulf and Eadwacer, you also have to do this puzzling. You have to figure out what is going on, because a lot of different words in the Old English have a lot of different translation possibilities. So for example, in the first line, which Trehairne translates as, "It is to my people as if someone would give him a gift." Now, there is a translation by Ian Shields, which you can also find on Wikipedia, which kind of tries to get closer to those ambiguities. So the way he translates that first line is, "For my people, it is as if someone is giving them/him a gift/favor/sacrifice/battle." Those are all reasonable interpretations for the words that get used in the Old English. But of course, if you were to use favor or sacrifice, that makes a big difference. If they are giving him a gift or they're engaging him in battle, those are two very different interpretations. So that polysemous nature, the fact that we kind of have to puzzle over the interpretations, over the translations, over how different things fit together. That is why sometimes it has been considered a riddle. And that also kind of fits because, well, at the end, at least in Trehairne's translation, they speak of the riddle of us two together. But of course, it isn't that easy, because the Old English word, which gets translated as riddle there, gied, can also be translated as song, or perhaps even as passion. So maybe something else is going on. And well, that's where I want to turn back to that question of genre. So we can tell that it's a poem. We can tell that it's surrounded by other poems which seem invested in maybe emotional experiences, in the consequences of a heroic culture, and maybe also to a certain extent in riddles. So what other genres have been proposed for this poem? Well, a very big one is Frauenlied, which is a German term for a medieval, well, mostly German genre or part of Minnesang. So Frauenlied literally means women's song, and the Minnesang is kind of hard to translate, but it's a more courtly sense of poetry, I would say, which flourished during the Middle High German period, during the kind of high courtly period starting around the 12th century and going on into the 14th century. In Frauenlieder, we mostly get monologues, which are lyrical, which have an I narrator, which seems to be a woman of noble birth, and they usually speak of love and of yearning for the partner and the kind of emotional issues that are connected to that. Now, that seems to fit very well doesn't it? If we already have a medieval genre of poems in which female narrators mourn the loss of a partner, mourn the consequences and emotional kind of suffering that they experience due to a man's absence, but also due to social requirements and kind of responsibilities, then, well, Wulf and Eadwacer seems to fit perfectly. The issue is that, as I said, this is a genre from the 12th, 13th century, and Wulf and Eadwacer was written down towards the end of the 9th century. That is about 300 years earlier. That makes a difference. So while these Frauenlieder make for a really interesting comparison piece to Wulf and Eadwacer, I always feel a little hesitant about accepting Frauenlied as a kind of genre application to Wulf and Eadwacer. It fits in a lot of different ways, but it is a lot earlier, and therefore its ancestry perhaps lies elsewhere. I think the two absolutely share connections. I do absolutely think that the genre of Frauenlieder was born out of poems like these, but the Frauenlieder that we know are more courtly. They differ slightly from what we have here. So again, we have extra information there which is useful to help us interpret Wulf and Eadwacer, but it does not necessarily give us closure or a final answer to what this poem is. But there is another genre that it's worth looking at, and that is elegy. Elegies are usually poems that reflect upon something. They are quite serious, and very often, especially in medieval literature, elegies are kind of laments for dead people. There can be such a thing as an elegiac tone, which is then a very mournful tone of, oh, these things have passed, the world has come to an end, everything has been lost. So that kind of very mournful tone. And we see that a lot in Old English literature. A lot of the poems, also those contained in the Exeter book, are considered laments. One of those is a poem I mentioned earlier, The Wife's Lament, which has been named thus by scholars because she kind of mourns over the fact that she has been exiled. It's a poem where you can also argue, but it definitely has those elegiac overtones. We also have The Wanderer, The Seafarer, a lot of Old English poems which fit into that category. And often these poems tell the story of individuals, of a personal plight. And what I always enjoy about elegies is that they are almost like a window into someone else's consciousness, into someone else's experience, into how they see the world and how they are affected by it. It is one of the stunning ways in which poetry and literature can provide us with a chance to feel empathy for people whose lived experiences are so different from us, because they are maybe removed from time because they lived hundreds of years ago, or also just in space, geographically, people who live very far away from where we live. But through these texts, through these poems, we can get an insight into how they feel, how their life has kind of developed and how they feel treated. So elegy is also a very interesting genre because you do feel like something is being mourned here, that our female narrator is lamenting the loss of perhaps the life she could have had, her love with Wulf, and maybe also at the end she is lamenting that her son is going to die, although we're not entirely sure because, well, what is going on there? So to make a very long story short, we can kind of assign Wulf and Eadwacer to 3 different genres of forms if we want to. It is surrounded by poems which speak of loss, which speak of difficulty, which contemplate the circumstances of society, so it could be an elegy. It has a female narrator who bemoans the loss of love and talks about the difficulty of her life. So we could connect it perhaps to Frauenlieder, even if they come a lot later in the Middle Ages. And it is surrounded by riddles, which fits very well because, well, it's hard to interpret a poem which uses so many words that can be translated in different ways. But with all of that confusion going on, I think it's only fair if I share my interpretation of the poem with you. I think Wulf and Eadwacer is the poem of a female character who finds herself in a very difficult situation. She is part of a group of people, of a family, of a society in which she perhaps doesn't have as much agency as she would like to. Her kin is violently minded towards the man she loves, and perhaps they have separated them, with Wulf being on one island and her on another. She knows that her people have evil intentions towards him, that they are bloody-minded, bloodthirsty, and that they would perhaps kill him if they had the chance. But she loves him, and she would have wanted to pursue him, to stay with him, but she can't, and that makes her sorrowful. I think that she then found another man. Perhaps she was given to him in marriage, perhaps she found him herself, but she was with him, and on the one hand she found joy in being with someone, but it was also a hateful experience to her, because she still had Wulf on her mind. And it makes her miserable that they are separated, and yet that she also gets comfort from someone else. The final lines cause me difficulty as well, when she speaks to Eadwacer, and she speaks of their wretched whelp, which has been born into the woods by a wolf. I think perhaps we get a sort of vengeance-themed thing here. These lines remind me of the story of Signý in the Old Norse Völsunga saga. Signý was married off to a man she did not love, and that man, a king, King Sigurd, then killed her father and most of her brothers, except for her twin brother Sigmundur, who she hid in the woods, and with whom through magic she conceived a son Sinfjotli. She helped her brother avenge their family against her husband, which also led to the deaths of the sons she had with King Sigurd. She felt that she had to support this vengeance, and to a large extent it was her plan as well. She very much plays a very important role in getting this vengeance against King Sigurd. But it also breaks her heart. At the end, when vengeance has been accomplished, when the hall of King Sigurd is going up in flames, Sigmundur says, "Come with me, come with Sinfjotli, and we can go live elsewhere." And she says, "No, I was married to this man. Vengeance has now been accomplished, and I am done." And she goes into the burning hall and perishes with, well, the husband she seemed to hate. But she can't also entirely let go of that bond, seemingly, and of the horrible things she had to do in order to gain revenge, which was the honorable thing to do, according to the saga. So I think when we also bring that context in, when we look at a figure like Signý, who becomes so torn between the different loyalties and responsibilities she has a responsibility towards her father, so she had to follow his word and marry this man. But she also has the responsibility of avenging his death, avenging the deaths of her other brothers. But she also has a certain loyalty to her husband and to his people and to the children they once shared before they died in the process of vengeance. There is no way for Signý to bring those different loyalties together. They contrast too strongly. And it is a very tragic kind of fate that she ends up with. And in Germanic cultures, such as the Old Norse, but also the Old English, we kind of see the fractures that this focus on honor leads to. And very often it is female characters who are at the center of that fracture and of that tension, because women got married off into other families in order to establish peace, to create kinship relations between different peoples, and so they married into a different group of people so that those two groups would no longer be fighting. If then anything went wrong, they found themselves torn between their blood family, where they came from, and their affinal kin relationships, the family they married into. Where do you put your loyalty? What is important to you? Is it your father? Is it your brother? Is it your husband? Is it your sons? Now, while that context might feel like I'm dragging that in there for the sake of an analysis or an interpretation, We do find connections to the Old Norse material in poems like Deor, which comes directly before Wulf and Eadwacer. These were stories which were known, I would say, across Europe to a certain extent. So a poem like this, which speaks from a female perspective, which seems to show an awareness of societal expectations, of the tensions that lay on their position, an awareness of the threat of danger and violence, of being torn between different men, different responsibilities, and also different things that the heart wants. Well, that is very complex. Those are all very difficult things to put into words. And I think a poem like Wulf and Eadwacer, which defies easy interpretation, which plays with all of these different aspects, where you can read into different words, different meanings, and thereby get slightly different poems, well, I think that's a very good medium in which to explore such kind of difficult societal expectations. On top of that, I also just think the poem is beautiful. I think the repeating refrain of "it is different with us," it really hits home in a way. And that final line of that may be easily separated, which was never bound, it speaks of heartache. And I think that is something that almost everyone can in some way relate to. The fragility of human connections, how easily they can be broken and separated if circumstances see fit. It makes medieval literature feel very immediate, very relevant. And that is partially why I keep sharing it with you. Now, it's also worth saying that because the poem has a female narrator, it has been very important in feminist scholarship of Old English literature and poetry as well. There have been a lot of different interpretations which consider how this poem may bring us closer to the female experience in the Middle Ages. But it's also worthwhile remembering there that we don't know who wrote this poem. The fact that it's placed in the Exeter book, it was most likely written in there by a monk who functioned as a scribe. He would have written it down. Perhaps it was also a man who first composed it. The Frauenlieder from Middle High German texts usually had male authors or male poets behind them. Therefore, we can't entirely say to what extent this was a poem written by a woman for women, but it does show a certain understanding of appreciation for the position of women, and therefore it has been very important in scholarship as well. Now, before I make an end to this long episode, I did want to just give you a taste of the Old English. So here we go. This is again from Elaine Trehairne's edition. Lerum is minum, svilce himmon lak gife, villath hyhine athajan, jev he on threath kymeth, unjelich is us. Wulf is on jege, ich on othere, feist is dat eglond, fenne beworpen, sindon valreoe, veras daar on ige, villath hyhine athajan, jev he on threath kymeth, unjelich is us. Wulfes ich minnes vid lastum venum dogode, thone het was renig veder, und ich reo zugusat. Thone mech se beode kafa bogum belegde, was me win zu thon, was me chwathre eert lath. Wulf min wulf, vena me thyne, seotje je dudon, thyne seldkymas. Moernende mod, nales metaliste. Je hyrest du, Eadwacter, unkerne ernach valp virus wulf te woeda, dat mon eachthe to sliteth, dat een neefre je somnad was, unkergiet geador. That is the poem in Old English, the best I could manage today at the very least. And yeah, I hope I've given you a little bit of an insight into how complex it can be to work with medieval texts when there is not as much context as you might like, when there's not as much information you can rely on, and when you have to base yourself on all kinds of little snippets of possible information, possible connection. But it's also a lot of fun puzzling it out. And that's it for today. If you have questions, thoughts on the book, or recommendations or requests for future episodes, feel free to leave a comment or send me an email at bookcentralpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. You can also subscribe to be informed when new episodes drop. You can find references to the materials used today in the description. Book Central is written and produced by me, and our music is by Scott Buckley. Thank you for joining me today on the International Express to Book Central.